Well, welcome all. This evening we have two stalwarts of the Kabbalah Shabbat evening. We have Irene giving us a Devar Torah, followed by Stuart doing the davening. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Irene.
Thanks, Morris. Okay. Right. Tomorrow we read about the spies in Shelach Lecha. And so I was thinking a bit about the land of milk and honey. Some of our greatest rabbis asked the question, why is Israel called the land of milk and honey? So let's see what they have to say. In fact, when God spoke to Moshe at the burning bush, he told him that he would redeem the Israelites, bring them to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And here we generally understand honey to be specifically date honey, not bees honey. Although there is archaeological evidence to show that beekeeping industry was there in ancient Israel as well, but they were all involved with this story. It was also the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, all the people that you read about in the Bible that were unfriendly. But there's a few things to note about that verse. Firstly, before the plagues, the land of Egypt, supported Israel and the Egyptians quite well, but God chose to call the new land good and spacious. The Ivrit word good means also pleasant, beautiful, fruitful, with economic benefits. So they had something to look forward to, a new life in a new land. And promoting the goodness of the land, God has mentioned the enemies of the land that must be overcome. And the nations displaced by Israel from a land flowing with milk and honey were significant in number, as we read as time went on through the Midbar. And they had to fight and die for the land. Also, Nachmanides writes that the key word in that sentence is the word flowing. Fruit trees grow in many different terrains, but their product overflows with nectar only when the land is especially fertile, when the trees are particularly well nourished. And similarly, livestock survives in many habitats, but overflows with milk when they're in very fertile pastures. Moshe tells Hashem when they enter Israel, the promised land, bless your people and the land which you have given us, as you swore to our forefathers, a land flowing with milk and honey. Says it again in Devarim. The assumption of a land flowing with milk and honey describes the fertility of the land and its agricultural fruitfulness, and it comes from many other parts of the Chumash where we read it. But later on in the Tanakh, the prophet's views often is that the abundance of milk and honey is derived from destruction of the land by many wars that go on. And there's one phrase when it says, a sentence, and it will come to pass on that day that a man will save a young cow and 2 goats from the quantity of milk that they will give. They shall eat cream, for cream and honey shall everyone eat who is left in the desolate land. Does that therefore mean that even when the land's desolate, they'll have plenty to eat and it'll be okay? But it says in every place where there has been 1,000 grapevines worth 1,000 pieces of silver, it will be covered with briars and thorns. And with arrows and bows shall men go there, because all the land will be briars and thorns. That's in Isaiah. But many of the other prophets also write about this. What do briars and thorns and destruction have anything to do with the abundance of milk and honey? Well, it's the cattle. They kept the cattle that could be milked, and they traveled around in search of food and forage everywhere. The more vegetation they found, the more milk they would be. So a land covered with vegetation means flowing with milk. Honey, the most plentiful areas are where the cattle produce the most milk, because there'll be abundance of flowers, and honey is mentioned several times in the Bible, never usually with the implication that it is a cultivated product. The biblical bees were wild, and the honey produced was public property, and people could take as much as they wanted. In Judges, it read, Samuel turned aside to see the carcass of a lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion, and honey, which he scooped out with his hands, and went on eating as he went. And he came to his father and mother and gave him some, and they ate. Others talk about the similar thing. People came into the forest, there was honey on the ground, and the honey was flowing. And this shows that in the Bible, honey is associated with uncultivated land, with wild vegetation. So maybe it's with cultivated lands as well, because we read about fertile lands in the country also. So it means maybe that Israel would always be blessed with able to give their people food. Hosea and Micah also describe things like this about devastation. So for the prophets, lush wild vegetation and forests symbolize desolation. However, the land of milk and honey relates to plentiful things in the land of Israel. So there must be a contradiction here, or a fact that everything adds together. Research showed that the Israelites were the first to establish permanent settlements in the most hilly regions of Israel. The uninhabited mountainous slopes must have been covered in virgin forests of every kind of native trees, shrubs, and flowers, and that's where they had their settlements, and they were shepherds and everything. You know, they also cultivated land too. We read also that the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, you may remember, went complaining to Joshua that they were upset because they only had one portion of the land. And it was Joshua that said to them, okay, if you're not happy where you are, go up to the forest and clear the ground for yourselves, because the hill country is not enough for you, and its produce will all be yours up there where the forests were. So the fertile valleys were inhabited maybe by the Canaanites, but also by the Israelites. They were cultivated, but so because of the trees and forests, they had plentiful foods, honey, milk, everything that went with that. So as told in Bamidbar, the spies and scouts were impressed by the lush vegetation and the wild forest land, the mountain slopes. So it's not surprising they gave, firstly, an enthusiastic report. We came to the land which you sent us to. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. If you remember, they actually picked in the valley. They cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes. They were enormous grapes, and they carried them on a pole between them to show the people. But at the same report, of course, we have all the other things. The land we've explored is a land that devours its inhabitants. All the people we saw are men of gigantic size, and we felt no bigger than grasshoppers, and that's how we looked to them. This frightening description alludes to various wild carnivorous animals that roamed the forest of Israel at the time. And there are a number of passages support this in Psalms, and they talk of lions, and in Jeremiah also talks of lions and bears in 2 Kings. So we have lions and boars and bears. They all found shelter in the forest, and it's likely then that the scouts were alarmed and fearful about the imminent appearance of these beasts in the forest. And it follows naturally that the land flowing with milk and honey is also described by the spies as a land that devours its inhabitants, where they felt the men of gigantic size could succeed and not smaller people. It's noted also that one time in Egypt was also called a land flowing with milk and honey, just once, and that was when Korach complained to Moshe during his revolt. He said, is it a small thing that you've brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness? This refers to the land of Goshen, which was where the Israelites lived. If you remember, they were given very fertile land because they were shepherds, and shepherds were actually abhorred by the Egyptians, and so they lived separately from them. And the shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptian. But the sheep and goats, of course, caused all these other things I spoke about before, the milk and the honey and so on. So that's why Goshen at that point was termed by Korach as a land of milk and honey. So it can describe uncultivated areas and cultivated areas in the same phrase. We do know that milk often is tied to fertility, so the milk could point to the abundance of the land. Honey tended to represent delight, joy, sweetness, and pleasure. And this combination could imply that Israel would no longer experience a time of bitterness and barrenness when they entered the Promised Land. While Israel's south and now is a desert, Israel also has fertile regions, this nowadays, including the Galilee and central Israel. Today, Israel is a world leader in science and technology that makes the best use of limited natural resources, especially water. And amazingly, it produces most of its own food and exports many food products. So from all the biblical things and so on, we can conclude that the land flowing with milk and honey indicates a greater good, the fertility of the Promised Land. The Midrash tells us that milk symbolizes superior quality, richness of taste, and nourishment. Honey represents sweetness. The goodness of Israel is both nourishing and pleasant. But why the pairing of milk and honey? Perhaps because milk is a product of animals and date honey is a product of plants. Milk and honey together represent completeness and harmony. Some point out that honey and milk share a quality. Honey is kosher, though it is produced by a non-kosher insect. Milk is kosher, though it comes from a cow whose meat may not be eaten together with milk. So we see that the goodness of Israel will often come from places where it is least expected. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you very much, Irene. Very illuminating.